Okay, so welcome to the deep dive, you guys. Today we're going to kind of shift gears a little bit.
Okay.
And we're going to look at this idea of like rebranding your life
Yeah.
and leveling up. And this is something that we've heard on the English Leap podcast. And we've been digging through a transcript from a YouTube video from Speak English with Class. And we're going to try to pull out just the most useful insights
Okay.
for you guys, the listener, so that you can really get those aha moments without feeling overwhelmed with too much information.
Yeah, I think that's really important.
So think of it as really distilled wisdom.
Yeah, it's about finding like the shifts in perspective and the actions that you can actually do to make a real improvement in your life
Yeah.
and not just rehash information that you already know.
Yeah, and just for some context for everyone listening, if you tuned in last time, we were really exploring this idea of mindset and confidence. And what we're going to talk about today really builds on that foundation. So, the first big takeaway that we found, and this one really resonated with me, is this idea of progress over perfection. So Aaron and Evan, the hosts of the English Leap podcast, were talking about how they used to feel so stuck because they thought everything had to be perfect right away, whether it was launching a new project or even just practicing their English. So what do you think is behind that feeling, like this need for it to be perfect right away?
Well, I think it can be really deep-seated, this idea that we have to be perfect.
Mm-hmm.
And it's almost like we have this critic inside us that sets this impossibly high bar before we can even begin.
Yeah.
And I think the fear of making a mistake can be so strong that it actually stops us from doing the things that would help us improve.
Absolutely. And Evan even gave this really relatable example about how he wanted to start a blog to get better at his English writing.
Yep.
And he was putting it off for months because he was worried about it not being good enough right away. So it was that fear that was holding him back. It's almost like waiting for every opportunity to be perfectly aligned before you take a step, you know?
It's like waiting for all the traffic lights to be green, all at the same time.
Yeah.
It's never going to happen. But we still have that feeling of like it needs to be just so.
Right.
But the irony is that by waiting for perfection, we actually delay the progress that we want.
Yeah, and the crucial shift here is realizing that perfection isn't a destination. It's more like a mirage.
Right.
Every time we kind of stumble and we make a mistake and you have to rephrase a sentence, that's all forward movement. That's the stuff that leads to getting better.
Yeah. And that's actually how we improve, through making mistakes.
Exactly.
And if we connect that to your experience, especially if you're learning English, it's so important to not wait until you feel perfectly fluent to start speaking.
Yeah.
Just speak now, even if it feels awkward or imperfect.
Yeah.
Every time you try to speak, it's a form of practice, and every bit of practice builds your skills and your confidence.
I love that.
It's like building a muscle.
Yeah.
You don't start by lifting the heaviest weight. You start with what you can manage, and you gradually increase.
Yes, and make sure you celebrate those small victories. Like, did you manage to have a short conversation today in English? Or did you understand a little bit more of that English video that you watched? Those are things to celebrate.
Yeah.
So the core idea here is to shift your focus away from perfection to continuous improvement. It's the progress, even if it's small steps, that keeps you moving forward.
Yeah, and it's interesting that releasing that need for perfection can actually unlock something else.
What's that?
A greater ability to be present in what you're doing. And that brings us to our next lesson, which is presence over distraction.
Oh, this is a relevant topic for today, especially because we're constantly bombarded with distractions. Our phones, buzzing notifications, emails, social media. It's so easy to be somewhere physically, but your mind is somewhere else completely. And even the hosts of English Leap podcast were talking about how they've been in conversations where their mind is somewhere else completely, like thinking about what they're going to eat for lunch.
I've definitely been there.
Me too. So have you found any ways to combat that?
Well, this feeling of multitasking, where we're trying to listen to something.
Right.
We're also checking emails and planning our next task. I think this is a really common experience today.
Yeah.
But how much are we really absorbing? When we do that,
Yeah.
when we try to do everything at once, I think very little. Our attention becomes fragmented.
Absolutely. And so being truly present means that you're giving your full attention to whatever's happening right now. And it's in those moments of focused attention that real learning and deeper understanding can happen.
Absolutely.
And they use this great analogy about watering plants.
Okay.
So if you're trying to water 10 different plants with a small cup of water, you're only giving a few drops to each plant. And they're not really thriving.
Right.
But if you focus on one plant with that small cup of water, it's getting what it needs to grow.
I love that analogy.
So when our attention is scattered, our effort is diluted. But when we cultivate presence, we're focusing our mental energy, and that leads to better learning. It leads to better connections with others and a better ability to remember information. And this is especially true for language learning. So focused practice, even if it's short bursts, is going to be much more effective than hours of distracted engagement. So if you're trying to memorize new vocabulary words, but you're scrolling through social media, it's probably not going to stick.
Right.
So if you set aside even 15 minutes where you eliminate distractions, you can focus on your English material, and you're probably going to remember a lot more.
So try this simple technique if you're listening, and especially if you're working on your English.
Sure.
Set a timer for 15 minutes.
Okay.
Put your phone on silent straight, close any unnecessary tabs on your computer, eliminate distractions, and dedicate that time to your English practice. You can use it for a lesson, a conversation, or some focused study, and you might be surprised how much more effective your learning is.
Yeah, and here's another cool thing about being present. You start to notice the small things, like those little positive moments or those small bits of progress that you're making.
Yeah.
And that leads us to our next lesson, because acknowledging those things can really spark gratitude.
Yeah, gratitude has this amazing power to shift our perspective. You know, the hosts of the English Leap podcast talked about their experience of feeling stuck and unhappy because they were always focusing on what they lacked. But then they found this really simple but profound practice.
Okay.
Every day they would write down just 3 things they were thankful for. And these could be really small things, like finishing a task, or understanding a new English phrase, or having a cup of coffee with a friend. So what kind of impact do you think a practice like that can have?
I think it's so grounding, because so many of us get caught up in this wanting more and focusing on what we don't have, like more time, more money, more skills, more fluency. And when you actually intentionally direct your attention toward what you already have and what's going well, you start to feel more content and way less stressed. It helps reframe your outlook.
That word reframe is so key here. Gratitude isn't about ignoring the challenges or pretending the problems don't exist. It's about choosing to not let those difficulties overshadow the good. That is also present. It's about finding a sense of balance and perspective in our mindset.
So if you're learning English and you're feeling frustrated with how far you have to go, take a moment to appreciate how far you've come already. Did you understand a new word today? Were you able to follow a conversation better than you could last week? That's progress, and it's definitely something to appreciate. And keeping a gratitude journal or just taking a few moments each day to think about things you're grateful for, it can really make a difference in your energy, your focus, and your overall motivation.
And it's fascinating how gratitude can also help us let go of this need to control everything. And that brings us to our next life lesson.
Okay.
Letting go of control.
Oh, this one's a big one for me. I think in the past I had a tendency to try and control every single detail. Anticipate every outcome, manage everything, and life, as we know, rarely goes according to plan. And trying to micromanage the uncontrollable just left me feeling so frazzled and worn out.
Yeah.
Can you think of any examples of when that need to control everything can be especially unhelpful?
The hosts of English Leap podcast actually shared a relatable example.
Okay.
They were talking about preparing for an English proficiency test and how much energy they wasted worrying about the specific topics that might be on the test and how other test takers were going to do, and even the testing environment itself.
Wow.
All these things they had absolutely no control over. And eventually they realized that it would be much better to focus on the things they could control, like their study habits and their mindset on the day of the test.
That makes sense. They use this analogy of carrying around a heavy backpack full of all these unnecessary items that you think you need to manage, but they're actually just weighing you down. So letting go of control is like taking off that backpack, and all of a sudden you can move more freely, you can breathe, and you feel lighter.
Yeah, that's a great visual, especially for English learners. You can't control how quickly other people learn, or someone's going to correct your grammar in a conversation. But what you can control is how much time and effort you're putting into your practice, the resources you use, and your attitude about the whole process. So when you release that need to control external factors, you free up mental energy to focus on what actually helps you grow.
I love that. So once you've let go of all that you can't control, you find yourself with more energy, more mental clarity, and a sense of freedom to focus on what really matters. And one of the most precious things you get back in that process is time.
Absolutely. And when you stop spending so much energy worrying, you start to appreciate the true value of time. And that brings us to our next lesson.
Okay.
Time is priceless.
Okay.
Spend it wisely.
So for a really long time, I think I operated under this illusion that time was this unlimited resource. And I would overcommit myself. I'd say yes to every request. And then I would just feel rushed and overwhelmed and depleted.
Yeah.
Does that sound familiar to you?
That's such a common experience.
Yeah.
We often fill our schedules to the brim, and we move from one task to the next. But at the end of the day, we feel exhausted. And we might not have even done what truly matters. Time is kind of like money. You can choose to invest it in things that bring value, or you can just spend it without even thinking.
Right. And the big difference here is that while you could often earn more money, you can never earn back time. And so once you realize that, it really changes how you look at your day.
Absolutely.
And the hosts of the English Elite podcast talked about how they started to be much more intentional with their time.
Okay.
So they would actually schedule blocks of time for rest or for learning or just for things that are important to them. So if you're an English learner, it's encouraging to remember that you don't need to dedicate hours and hours each day to making progress.
Right.
Even just 15 to 20 minutes of focused study time can lead to huge results, especially if you're consistent. It's about quality, not quantity. So be deliberate with your time, set goals, minimize distractions, and acknowledge yourself for intentionally using your time to grow.
And one of the most effective ways to protect your time and energy is by learning to do something that can be pretty challenging.
What's that?
Saying no.
Oh yeah, the power of saying no. I used to be such a people pleaser. I would say yes to everything, even when I was overextending myself. I didn't want to disappoint anyone, but in the process, I was neglecting my own needs. Does that sound familiar to anyone?
That feeling of agreeing to things because you don't want to disappoint people,
Right.
or you want to avoid conflict, it's so common. But if you always say yes to everything, you can end up burned out, resentful, and actually less effective in all areas of your life.
Wow, yeah, that makes sense. So learning to say no, even though it can feel uncomfortable, is an important act of self-respect.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it helps us preserve our energy.
Yeah, and they had this really interesting analogy about saying no. They said it's like building a fence around your property. It's not about being unfriendly or isolating yourself. It's about creating space for yourself to thrive.
Yeah.
And if you're an English learner, this could mean saying no to those unproductive scrolling sessions online, or saying no to distractions when you're trying to concentrate. You can even say no to that voice inside you that tells you not to speak up because you might make a mistake. And so by saying no to these things, you're creating space to actually grow and learn.
Exactly. And remember, protecting your peace. Your time and your energy isn't selfish. It's essential to your well-being and how you achieve your goals.
Yeah. Those are finite resources, you know. You can't give them away all the time. So don't feel obligated to just constantly say yes to everything. Sometimes no is the best thing you can do for yourself and for others.
Absolutely.
Because then you can really invest your time and energy where you can make a real contribution. And ultimately, by saying no to certain things, you're creating the opportunity to say yes, to investing in yourself.
That brings us to our last and most important lesson.
Was that?
Invest in yourself. For so long we thought that taking care of ourselves or making time for our growth and well-being is something we have to earn, or that it's a luxury.
Yeah.
You know, we think we can only do it
Yeah.
after we've achieved everything else, but that's not true.
Right.
Taking care of yourself is actually the foundation for everything else you do. You know, there's a saying, you can't pour from an empty cup. So if you're depleted, you won't be effective in any area of your life.
Yeah.
And the host shared some examples of what it means to invest in yourself.
Okay.
It could be reading a book that you find interesting, or getting enough rest, or consciously practicing your English, or even just going for a walk outside. And the amazing thing is that when you do those things, your focus, your energy levels, and your productivity actually increase.
I love that.
It's a positive cycle.
Yeah, it's like the analogy they use is like maintaining a car. If you neglect regular maintenance on your car, eventually it's going to break down. And the same is true for our minds and our bodies. You know, they need regular care and attention. So for English learners, this might mean setting aside some dedicated study time, or investing in a good language course, or making sure that you get enough rest so your brain can really absorb new information.
Yeah.
And hey, even listening to this deep dive is an investment in yourself. So give yourself credit for showing up and prioritizing your learning.
That's so true. It's amazing how quickly our time together is gone.
I know.
It feels like we've only just started to explore these ideas.
I know. I was so engaged in the conversation that I completely lost track of time.
Yeah.
That's always a good sign.
It is a sign of a good discussion.
Yeah.
Well, for everyone listening, we are coming to the end of our deep dive. But don't worry, we've compiled all these key takeaways into a PDF guide for you. You can find the link in the show notes, so be sure to download it. And revisit these ideas. There are some practice exercises in there as well.
Oh, that's fantastic. And also, we want to give a shout out to Charlotte from the Speak English with Class YouTube video for her great vocabulary breakdown, because understanding keywords like mindset, impactful, move the needle, resonate paralyzed by fear, hinder illusion, show up for yourself, retain information, reframe a situation, overshadow and control freak can really help with your understanding of this topic.
And to reiterate that main message, remember that practice makes progress,
Right.
not perfection.
Exactly. So we encourage you guys
Okay.
to think about these life lessons that we talked about today and think about how you can use them in your own life and your English learning journey.
And here's a final thought to leave you with. Out of these 7 lessons we talked about today, progress over perfection, presence over distraction, the power of gratitude, letting go of control, valuing your time, the power of saying no, and investing in yourself. Which one of these resonates most with you right now, and what's one small step that you can take today to implement that lesson in your life or in your English learning?
That's a great question for everyone to think about. Thanks for joining us today
It's been a pleasure.
on The Deep Dive. We'll see you next time.